Hey guys, and welcome to the video. Today I want to discuss coding habits, and I want to take two approaches on this. I want to discuss good coding habits, so things which I think if we do as programmers tend to make us better on down the line. I also want to discuss how we can try and remove negative coding habits from our practice, so things like distractions and poor quality code, etc. A lot of this is based around this book here, and of course I want to make a fair amount of reference to this, and this is Atomic Habits by James Clear. If you look at any kind of top chart on productivity books, I guarantee this one is going to be up here somewhere. According to this, it's sold over 1 million copies, which is pretty good. The book's really good. It's written super nicely. There's tons of kind of anecdotes. It's not that difficult to read. It's not super long, and it's broken down into really kind of nice, clear sections. So this video is going to be starting off with this. We'll talk about some of the core ideas. We'll then go into the bad coding habits and then into the good coding habits, and then we'll wrap it up with a small summary. So one of the things the book kind of focuses on is it's not just about building habits from now on. It talks a lot about how to break existing bad habits. So you basically got these two pathways. If you want to build good habits for the future, it's good, it talks about that. If you want to kind of remove poor habits from your general life, it talks a lot about that as well. Of course, for this video, I want to focus on the bad habits and the good habits purely from a coding point of view. Now, as to summarize this in as small as I possibly can, is that it breaks down a habit into effectively four things. We've got a cue, a craving, a response, and a reward. So let's say we take a bad habit, for example. For me, a bad habit used to be just checking my phone religiously, and it got super annoying, and it used to just do my head in. Now, the cue for this would simply be maybe seeing your phone, or your phone goes off, or you hear it do some kind of vibration, it's somewhere, and then straight away, your mind is thinking, my phone exists. That might be quite nice to go and check, or to scroll through Reddit or something like that. So that would then be the craving. So you've seen the cue, and straight away you're thinking about, okay, I could probably do with checking those little notifications I can see from a distance. Then the response is, yeah, you guessed it, you grabbing your phone and then turning it on and having a little look. And then finally, the reward is maybe some kind of dopamine hit from you scrolling through Instagram and doing some doom scrolling for half an hour. So that's it. It's like a cue is seeing something, your brain is picking it up and saying, wouldn't it be nice to go and do that thing? You then do it, you get this nice reward, and that just repeats. So it really instills this cue, craving, response, reward model. And if you get the book, which I highly recommend doing, it's really easy to see yourself doing this, especially with your bad habits. And one of the other tenets it kind of promotes is that it's not just about doing tons and tons of work in one go. It talks about kind of doing these very small incremental changes, maybe once a day or once in some given time period, and just sticking to that religiously. So making this small productive act a habit, and then trying to build on that habit over time, and eventually over time you've achieved something really good. So with that super short summary, let's go into our bad coding habits and how we can try and address them. So our first bad coding habit, and I'm not sure if this is super relevant for everyone, but it definitely was for me, was distractions. So as I've just alluded to, mine was my phone. So the biggest thing for that really is I thought, okay, I want to try and address how often I pick this up whilst I'm coding. I'm doing some coding, I suddenly flick to this. Before I know it, I've lost the train of thought on the screen, and I feel like I'm back to square one. And I'm not really in the zone with the code, if that makes sense. I feel like I need to be really settled into it, looking at it for maybe a good 15, 20 minutes, then I can really focus and write some high quality stuff. And this was just getting in the way. So a really simple one for this was just removing the cue. So on a Mac, I can hit Do Not Disturb. It'll do it to like my iPad, the Mac, and the phone. And then the second one was just leaving it out of sight. So for me, it was literally just leaving it on that shelf. So with that being over there, it's no longer in my field of view. I can't see it. And it's crazy how simple that is. Just having it out of your field of view is kind of like, it's like your subconscious isn't thinking, the phone's next to my keyboard. So next time my code isn't quite working or I'm feeling a bit frustrated, I might just pick that up and get the same dopamine hit from Instagram or Reddit. Just moving it over there, it's gone. And that's one thing I would highly recommend doing. If you're starting out in coding and you're trying to get these nice productive learning sessions in, remove as many distractions as you possibly can, but focus on removing them from kind of your visual space of where you're trying to learn. So I'm quite lucky that I've got this nice office. It's relatively distraction free. I've got some albums, a nice plant, some lamps, and my camera gear. There's not really a whole lot to play with and look at. Admittedly, I do sometimes still walk around the house if I'm bored, but generally, I feel like I can focus in this space. So my first piece of advice, make sure your learning on coding environment is as distraction-free as you can possibly make it. Now, the second bad coding habit, I think I've done fairly well to kind of remove myself from now, is trying to write perfect code straight away. My philosophy on this has sort of changed over time. I used to be obsessed with writing super perfect code that was absolutely as efficient as possible, in my view anyway, and trying to get this like as my first pass. What I've kind of changed more to now is this kind of MVP, kind of iterative approach. So MVP is minimal viable product, and it's about starting off with a sort of a skeleton of your code first and making it so it's kind of just doing the bare minimum to do what is required. Suppose, for example, you want to write a class which logs into an email system and sends an email and it's going to run on schedule. The first pass the post might literally just be a simple bit of code to log in and send an email. So no unit tests, no exception handling, no kind of input validation, nothing like that. That should be your first pass the post. And then suppose you come back to it for your second time, you try and build on it, you make it better and better each time you go on. Of course, the situations where maybe you're doing this for work, you can't do this, but for my personal projects and stuff I do on the side, I think this approach is generally much better. I think one, because I can focus on this kind of skeleton, get it to do like the bare basics, and then when I'm coming back to it second time, I've had this time in between coding sessions to kind of think about what I've done, let that code sink in. So when I come back to it for the second time, I've got like a fresh set of eyes and a fresh head, and I've had time to kind of think about the task I'm trying to do. It sounds like a really silly one, but I think if you try and get your code absolutely perfect and super cool and crisp right from the offset and really rush it, you're at more risk of burnout, I think, and you're at more risk of making mistakes, where I think simply just taking your time, especially on personal projects, it sounds like a really silly one, but I think it makes a massive amount of difference. So my advice for this would be to employ some kind of time-based system. Really cool one is the Pomodoro technique. It's basically where you do like 20 minutes on, 10 off, 20 on, 10 off. You can like mix and match those times as much as you want. But suppose you're building this email project, you're logging in, you're sending an email, you're doing lots of input validation, lots of unit tests. You might just spend the first 20 minutes writing out like skeleton classes, skeleton methods, and just kind of looking through it and making sure that the layout of your code actually makes sense. You go for a break, you come back later, and you could then maybe start to build up that method which actually logs into the email server, write some tests for that, test it to hell and back, go away, come back, rinse, repeat. I think this is a much more sustainable way of coding. You're less prone to burnout, and I think it's nice to have that time away from the computer to at least let especially complex bits of code you've just done sink in and kind of understand what they're doing. And my third coding habit, which I think I've done fairly well at kind of breaking away from, my first couple of years of coding, I can look back at my projects and I've broken this in like nearly every single function and class I've done. And this is a bit more specific, but these are functions and methods and code in general that breaks what's called the SRP, and that is the single responsibility principle. If you're familiar with like the solid principles, this is the S. The S from the solid principles is this principle. Basically says that a function or a method should only have one job or one purpose. Let me give an example as to why this might be important. Suppose let's bring our email example back. Suppose you got a method and its job is to send the email, okay? Now, let's suppose you then put in some validation, you then put in some checking to make sure it's got a response back from the server, you then maybe add some things to write an output to a file at the end of that function. Suddenly you got a function that's doing like 3 or 4 different jobs. And one is going to make unit tests a right pain in the ass for that function to test every single like exit point works well. 2, suppose one of the bits in your function breaks. So imagine like the actual email sending bit breaks. You've then got to tinker around with code which is possibly working, but you're now tinkering around a bit as well. Whereas if you have these really simple discrete blocks, it can work out in such a way where if something breaks, you're basically maximizing the chance where you're only touching the broken bits of code. Now it sounds really silly, it sounds like it's a way to just write tons of methods and tons of functions, whereas in some situations it can mean you're writing less. Yeah, you're writing like def, and you're doing tons of functions, tons of methods, but it can make it so that these functions and methods are a lot smaller, they're a lot cleaner. And another bonus is that if other people are working with your code, it's much, much easier to read code that is written in this way. And this is something which I've definitely employed now. I think it's super useful. And since I've kind of realized this principle and kind of start to stick to it, I feel like my code is just a lot cleaner. And say for example, I do a project and come back to it like 6 months later, it's really easy to kind of go through a class where, yeah, it might have 6 or 7 methods, but each of those methods has a really clear, distinct, single purpose that it's doing. So if you're not trying this at the moment, I'd recommend trying to pick this up and ingrain this habit into your coding practice. Now let's talk about some good coding habits. We've talked about 3 bad ones, which we're going to try and remove ourselves away from, hopefully. And now our good coding habits, I want to mention a few which I think you can do, 1, super easily, and 2, I think these give a really good like return on your investment. Yeah, it takes a couple of seconds to write, one of these things I'm going to say, but down the line, I think you'll thank yourself. And also, these are quite often expected in the industry as well. So if you're looking to kind of break into the job market and you're not doing these, I'd recommend picking them up because they're really useful. The first one is inline comments. I will be flashing up an example in just a second as well. And inline comments can be a really simple, clear way to basically say, this bit of code is doing this. Now, especially if you're using maybe a more obscure library or some weird comprehension, or you're doing some kind of crazy recursive call, if it's not entirely explicitly obvious what a bit of code is doing, and you're working with other people, or even like you're unsure of what this code is doing, writing a simple bit of code to say maybe, this is a recursive call to this, and here's what I expect to happen. You could probably come back to that in like 6 months' time and say, oh God, what's this bit of code doing? But then your little inline comment will just tell you what it's doing. This is a great, easy, simple coding habit. Let's go take a look and see what these look like. So this would be a really simple example of an inline comment. Suppose I had a list of numbers here. So I've just defined 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, and a simple list comprehension to say, give me everything from that numbers list, but only if that number, when modded by 2, is equal to 0. So effectively saying, give me the numbers that are even. So suppose if I was looking at this for the first time and I was a bit unsure as to what this meant here, I could do something like this and keep it really simple. We could say this means modulus and gives the remainder of whole division. Of course, you can write this kind of however you want, but I would generally do it as a single line, keep it really simple and straight to the point. Good coding habit number 2 is looking for multiple sources for answers to your questions. So as people who code, we're probably on Stack Overflow like half the day. I'm on there quite a lot, of course. But obviously it's not the only place where you might find answers to your questions. So say you're trying to work out a new library, you're stuck on something. What I used to do was just like go to the first Stack Overflow post, look at the answer and go, okay, let's just have a go at this then. What I'm trying to do now is, even though I might have found like a correct solution, I'm always really interested in maybe going through 3 or 4 other different posts and maybe exploring a couple of different solutions to the same problem. Just because the first one worked, it doesn't mean it's the best that's going to work. So as tempting as it is to take the first solution, stick that into your code and just hit run. And then if nothing bad happens, just be like, yeah, cool. Try a few, like slow down. Maybe go through like 3 or 4, see if they're different. And if they are different, maybe have a go at trying each of them and seeing which one works best for you. Of course, some might be more efficient and some might just be easier to understand. And then to link back to the first one, if you're, of course, taking a new bit of code from Stack Overflow, definitely use an inline comment. Tell yourself what this bit of code is doing. Sometimes you can even put a URL back to the Stack Overflow post, just in case you need some kind of reference point. Now, the third one I want to go for is function annotations. Now, this is where I guess, first of all, you might want to apologize to yourself because in the bad coding habits, we talked about doing lots and lots of little mini discrete functions that do one job. Writing a function annotation for each of them might be a bit tedious, but I still think the payoff is really good. I'd rather have lots of little functions that have a single purpose with nice annotations than like 3 or 4 kind of giga functions with crazy stuff inside them and a paragraph for the annotation. So a function annotation really is just a bit of code inside the top of your function which says this function does this. It might list what the arguments are, it might list what it returns, and it's a nice, simple, clear way, especially to tell other developers what your bit of code is doing, what it takes in, what it does, what it gives back. And if you're wanting to go work in the industry as well, you will 99%, I'm certain about this, you'll be required to put these in your code anyway. Especially if you're using some kind of CI/CD which checks for docstrings, yeah, you're going to need to be having these in. So as a coding habit, I'd want to make sure that my function's written, it does a single job, so removing that bad coding habit from earlier. I then want to make sure that the annotation explains exactly what the function's doing, what it takes in, what it gives back. And before we move on to the next point, let's go take a look at a quick example. So here's my function. It's probably as simple as you can possibly make it. It's a function called calculate rectangle area. It's taking in length and width, which are both integers, and it's then going to also return an integer as well. All it's doing is simply setting a variable area equal to length multiplied by width, and then returning that variable. Now my function annotations and my docstring here are about as good as I think I could possibly make them. We've clearly defined that our length and width should be integers, so that will appear to the user as soon as they go to call the function. That's also the same for the return value as well. I've done a simple line to say this is what it does, and I've clearly defined my arguments and what the function returns. Now the last coding habit I think is a really powerful one to do, and it's also incredibly simple, is just keeping paper notes. So this always stays on my desk. It comes to work with me. It comes most places with me. Not everywhere, but yeah, as you can imagine, but it comes a lot of places with me. And I think the power of this is that it gives you a chance to kind of really think about the more difficult bits of code that you've been doing. So if I'm, say, doing a bit of work in a new language, quite often I'll just write about some of the stuff I've done. So I'll write about maybe some of the functions, perhaps some of the features of that language I've been a bit unsure on. And it just gives me time later on to perhaps go through this, recap on the notes, and just try and instill what I did earlier on in the day. I think there's definitely a positive aspect to writing down the things that you're stuck on, writing out kind of a solution and your kind of thoughts on it, and then checking back on these like a few hours later when you're away from the computer. It's something I've done for years. I think it's incredibly helpful. When I was doing my thesis on deep learning in Python, I did this religiously. So I'd be working on a bit of code, trying to get some stuff to work, and then I would just kind of summarize the thoughts about what I had just done and perhaps scribble out a bit of the code I've been working on in here. And then on the way home, I could then kind of check back through these notes and just try and digest it away from the context of the computer. Now, it sounds like a silly one, but it's incredibly simple. And I think, if you can just get hold of a notebook like this and keep it by your computer, if you're really stuck and then suddenly something clicks and you understand it, step back for a sec, write down what you've just done, write down what the problem was. And I think it just serves as a nice way to reinforce the solution to a problem. So guys, there you have it. Just to summarize, we've looked at a couple of different bad coding habits I think that are worth removing. Of course, I've just done 3. Those are 3 that I've tried to remove from my own kind of personal coding life. And we've touched on a few good coding habits as well. I'll make sure these are all written down just to kind of summarize them in the description. I've also put a link to the book as well. And of course, guys, just like in the last video, I've actually really enjoyed going through all the different comments and suggestions and kind of thoughts on the previous book. I'd like to see the same here as well. So if you have any ideas of good coding habits you've picked up maybe over the years, I'd love to hear them. And of course, I respond to every comment as well. Cheers for watching, guys, and see you all in the next video.